Try it again. Good afternoon. Well, this is exciting. We are running a little late, so we're going to try to make up on time. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Theresa Singleton, and I am the Community Affairs Officer and Vice President of Community Development Studies and Education at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the 6th Biennial Reinventing Older Communities Conference. As I look across the room, I am just blown away. We have over 455 people registered for this year's Reinventing Conference, which is close to a record. We're extraordinarily pleased to see so many folks from so many different communities and representing so many different fields here to engage in this very important conversation that we are framing as bridging growth and opportunity. We have folks here from 25 different states. We had a bus load of people join us from Baltimore, Maryland, and you'll hear more about how and why that came about, but we welcome you one and all from far and wide, and we are just so excited to get started here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our theme, Bridging Growth and Opportunity, a little later. But what I wanted to do is to give you all just a quick sense of the things that we have going on around the conference, just some of the highlights, and thank some of our partners before introducing our president, Charles Plosser, who's going to give our official welcoming remark. So, you know, some things changed, some things stay the same. I want to highlight some of the things that have changed with this year's Reinventing Conference. And it's great. We've got some new faces, some old faces. So some of these things will seem very familiar to you, but some of these things will be new. So as some of you walked in, you saw there was a table. You received many emails saying, sign up for the conference app. So the conference app is new. And for those of you who were here in 2012, you know I am technologically disadvantaged, and I signed up for the app. So the conference app is a way for you not only to know what's going on at the conference, but it's a very effective way for you to connect and network with people that are here today. And so I encourage you, if you have an opportunity, if you are technologically disadvantaged like myself, there are people out in the lobby who would be glad to help you load the app and figure out how to set your own agenda, connect with other people here in the conference, and follow this conversation that we have going on today. The second thing that's somewhat changed is around Twitter. Again, not my strong suit, technology, but last time in 2012, we began a Twitter feed around the conference. We've continued that this year, and folks have been tweeting about the conference at #Reinvent2014, and you'll see instructions for tweeting on your tables. We encourage you to engage in a lively conversation, and as some of you might have noticed out in front of the ballroom, there is a stream of tweets. And so your comments are part of the ongoing conversation that we'll be having. You feel free to post comments and as well as questions that we'll try to feed into our moderators for the various plenary sessions that we have for you throughout the event. The third new thing that I'm very excited to announce is that we are very well represented with a full and robust group of graduate students here at the conference this year. We are often asked to host graduate students at functions, and our department takes very seriously our responsibility for helping to encourage the next generation of community development researchers. So this year we were able to subsidize the graduate student rate, and we have about 35 graduate students in and amongst the conference attendees, and we are so excited to have them engaged in this conversation around older industrial cities and our more specific conversation about bridging opportunity and growth. So the things that are staying the same. So you've got some of the same people, and we are hoping to give you excellent customer service over the next couple of days. Anyone with a host badge can help you with any questions that you have about the event. The major thing that has stayed the same is the conference design. The conference is designed to encourage feedback and interaction between practitioners and academics. Our department, as many of you have heard me say time times before, is that we are committed to creating opportunities to promote research-informed practice and practice-informed research. That means we want to get practitioners and researchers in the same room talking about the same issues and influencing one another in terms of the topics that they are addressing, the policies and programs that they're rolling out. We do this in our workshops, and we hope to do this at our luncheon tables and in our hallways as well. So please take the opportunity to meet someone, engage with someone who may be approaching this work from a different place, but we're all trying to get to some of the same solutions. The last thing that stays the same, and you're going to hear me say this almost every time I get up here, is that we want your feedback. You will see, if you picked up a conference packet, that there is a tab for evaluations. If you've signed on to the app, there is a place for you to fill out your evaluation on the app. We seriously want your feedback. We use that feedback to develop programs, not only for the next Reinventing Older Communities, but programs in the interim. We are very responsive to the words that we receive back from our attendees. Last year, some of you may know that after the previous Reinventing, we sent out a post-evaluation asking folks to tell us, what did you implement? What did you hear, or who did you meet at Reinventing that had some impact in your work? And we were just pleased to see the number of responses and the depth of the experiences that people shared with us about people that they met and information that they gained at the Reinventing conference. And so we hope that this experience will be just as rich for all of you, and we encourage you to share with us how we can make that so. I'm going to end off by just thanking our partners. As you all know, you cannot pull off an event of this size or scale without the hard work and commitment of a broad network of partners. I first want to just acknowledge that we had over 65 supporters, and those are the folks who shared the message about the conference with you all, folks who used their mailing lists and their websites to really promote the Bridging Growth and Opportunity Conference theme, and they really helped get you all in the room here today. And so we're very grateful to our supporters. We had a number of co-sponsors that I'd like you to help me thank this afternoon. The Annie Casey Foundation has a new sponsor to the Reinventing Older Communities Conference, and they've been engaged in a fair amount of the thinking and planning around the conference, and so we're very grateful to our partner Scott Spencer of the Annie Casey Foundation. The Fund for Our Economic Future, a foundation collaborative in Northeast Ohio, is a recent co-sponsor of the event. The Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh, as well as the Penn Institute for Urban Research, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Susan Wachter and Jeannie Birch have been key partners in the planning of this event, as well as planning for the book, Shared Prosperity, that is under development, that reflects the themes of the conference that you'll be discussing over the next few days. I'd also like to thank Karen Black at May 8 for her critical, valuable contributions to the planning of the conference. And lastly, I'd like to thank our partner, Federal Reserve Banks of Philadelphia. The Federal Reserve are other partners in the system. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland has been an instrumental partner in the planning and marketing of this event, and so we owe them a huge amount of thanks for that. The Federal Reserve Banks of Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Richmond, New York, and St. Louis have all identified older industrial cities to be key places in their districts, and they have been firmly engaged in the planning and the implementation of the conference. So please join me in thanking our sponsors for bringing us all together here today. Thank you. I promise to be very brief before I hand things over to Charles Plosser. Dr. Plosser is president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and he has been president since August of 2006. Before coming to Philadelphia, President Plosser was a professor of economics and dean of the school there, of the Business Administration School from 1993 to 2003. So I want to go a little bit off bio on President Plosser and just mention something about his internal management of the bank. When I first started at the bank, he asked two questions, or before I started, he asked two questions in my interview, and these are questions that I think he asks all of us across the bank every day. He asks us, how can you bring innovation to the work that you do? And he asked us every day. How do you know you're making a difference? What's your impact and what are you doing? And so those are two questions that guides, I believe, his work and his management and leadership of the bank. And I think that those are contributions that he can make in his opening remarks to you here today. And so I would ask you to please join me in welcoming President Charles Plosser.
Thank you, Theresa, and welcome everyone. You sort of set the bar kind of high for me, didn't you? I wasn't expecting that, but thank you. And it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Reinventing Older Communities Conference. As Theresa said, this is the 6th biannual conference that we've hosted here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. It's grown to be one of the important events in the Federal Reserve System as we bring together a rich, diverse mix of stakeholders who are interested in understanding the interaction between older industrial communities and the broader economy. Now, the Federal Reserve System, which is marking its centennial year, by the way, the Federal Reserve Act was signed by Woodrow Wilson on December 23rd of 1913. We are a unique form of central bank. We are a decentralized central bank with 12 individual reserve banks from around the country, overseen by the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. So as Theresa mentioned, we are delighted that 7 of the 12 banks are partnering with us in this conference today, and we're delighted to have their support and their participation. We thank them. And I also want to thank all the other sponsors, many of whom Theresa mentioned, for their support that help create conferences like this, what I think is going to be an outstanding event. But most of all, I want to thank all of them, but most of all, I want to thank you, all of you, for taking the time to be here and participate. It's your participation that makes the ongoing work in communities around our nation, those of you doing that demonstrate your commitment to bridging opportunities and growth. In fact, it's with your help we can reinvent our communities and ensure that they are places where people can lead fulfilling and successful lives. But that work is difficult, and it requires you and others like you in your fields to be creative, innovative, and forward-looking. Maybe it's because it's May, the Stanley Cup is still going on, and it may go on for a while yet, I guess. But I'm reminded of a saying by the great Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky was asked about his success as a hockey player. And he replied, he was known as the Great One for those of you who don't play hockey, but the Great One said, and I quote, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been." He scored a lot of goals with this strategy and became a very successful hockey player. Yet I believe that philosophy, or that strategy, if you will, can be helpful in many disciplines. I've talked about it in the context of monetary policy, where monetary policy has to be forward-looking. We have to worry about where the economy is going to be in the future if we're going to set the right monetary policy today, because those decisions we make really won't be felt for some time to come. But I think this philosophy bears fruit in lots of different disciplines, and it bears fruit particularly in the revitalization of older communities. Now, those of you who know me know I'm an economist. I'm not a community development expert, and I'm certainly not a hockey player. But during my lifetime, I've lived in a number of places, both older communities and newer communities. For example, I lived in Rochester, New York for many years. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, where I was born. I attended college in Nashville, graduate school in Chicago. I lived and worked in New York City, and I lived in Los Altos Hills, California, near the heart of Silicon Valley. And I've been here in Philadelphia for almost 8 years now. And living in all those places and seeing those different communities both succeed and at times fail, I've learned a few things, maybe not much, but a little. And it has occurred to me, and this will come as no surprise, that older communities that seek to turn back the clock to restore their past glories, a variation, if you will, of chasing the puck. But even after chasing the puck, they find themselves perpetually in the past, never quite catching up, and usually falling further and further behind. Either chasing the puck or living or restoring past glories tend not to be very successful strategies. Yes, it's important to learn from the past, and by all means we must learn from the past. But trying to restore the past is not a strategy for success. As most of you realize, and are well aware, rebuilding and revitalizing older communities is really not about the past. It's about our ability to seize the future. The Philadelphia of tomorrow is not going to be the Philadelphia of the past, nor should it be. There are many opportunities for productive transitions, innovations, and improvements. Indeed, we should think of ways to exploit latest innovations, to make Philadelphia, like so many other post-industrial cities around our nation, many of whom are represented here today. We need to seize those opportunities and innovations in order more fruitful and productive environments. We have to acknowledge that our world has changed, and it continues to change at a rapid pace. Embracing that change in order to reinvent the future of our cities is hard work, but it certainly can pay off quite handsomely. The extent to where we are able to see emerging trends or where things are headed, where the puck is going, if you will, gives us the chance to take advantage of those opportunities. That will allow our communities to be successful and effective. I want to spend just a few more minutes of my brief time with you discussing a few emerging issues for you to consider and think about for the next few days as you anticipate the conference and as I anticipate some of the conference sessions we'll focus on. And I'm going to focus on a couple of things, but mostly I'm going to focus on labor markets and the importance changes in the labor markets are having in shaping the future of our nation, but it's not only relevant for our nation, but true for our future cities and communities where we live. The financial crisis and the Great Recession have led to severe dislocations in many sectors of our economy, including finance, housing, labor markets in general. Monetary and fiscal authorities have responded aggressively in a variety of ways to try to help push the economy and restore health to our economy during this recovery. But we should resist the temptation to implement programs with the goals of recreating the past. The unemployment rate has slowly recovered, now standing at 6.3%, down from its peak of over 10% in October of 2009. Yet some are skeptical because the decline in the unemployment rate has been accompanied by not just reductions in unemployment, but reductions in labor force participation rates. Now, many interpret such declines in the participation rate as representing discouraged workers, people who have dropped out of the labor force or stopped looking for work. Yet a lot of things are reflected in the labor force participation rates. There's also demographics. Indeed, labor force participation rates have been declining since the year 2000. And they've been steadily declining, and we can account for about 3/4 of the entire decline in the labor force participation rates since December of 2007, when the recession began. We can account for 2/3 of that decline through retirements and movements into disability. Demographic trends, of course, are driven largely by an aging baby boomer generation. And that's altering the age distribution of our population. More specifically, we are getting older. I know I am. You may not be, but I'm getting older. Okay? We're getting older. The size of the working age population is shrinking relative to the size of the elderly. And it's widely recognized that this fundamental shift in our demographics will require major changes and relooks at programs for the aged, particularly Social Security and Medicare. Yet even if we solve those fiscal challenges that are associated with the aging population, we also have to face up to the changing skills that employers are seeking. We are seeing a degree of mismatch of skills in the workforce and the jobs that are in fact being created for the future. Many employers I've spoken to around the country talk about the fact that while they are hiring new workers, they're hiring a new type of worker. They're not hiring the same workers that they let go several years ago. They're hiring a worker that is more technologically sophisticated, more productive, more efficient. And going forward, our educational system needs to be upgraded. It needs to prepare our young people for this changing labor market. We are simply not keeping pace. More specifically, business leaders I've met and talked to repeatedly about this are having trouble finding qualified candidates in the areas specifically science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM jobs. As you know, the increasing needs of STEM-trained workers is one of the trends that will drive labor force demand and productivity growth in our future. The Department of Commerce estimates that STEM employment grew at 3 times the rate of non-STEM employment in the previous decade, and it will continue to grow at least twice the rate through the next decade. Sadly, we are not doing an adequate job of preparing our workforce for these jobs. Manufacturing is one sector in which firms have implemented new production technologies. Those new production technologies require a different workforce. Philadelphia Fed's April Business Outlook survey of manufacturers included a special question recently about the factors influencing their decisions about where to locate and whether they want to stay in the region or move. Respondents identified the availability of skilled labor as the most important factor shaping their location decisions. They also ranked availability of skilled labor as becoming a more important factor in recent years than it used to be in the past. So these concerns highlight the importance of our educational system in equipping our young people with the skills necessary to improve their own lives and improve their communities in which they live and work. Better wages, higher standards of living accrue to more productive employees. Firms will not locate in communities where they cannot find workers with the right set of skills or the right work ethic. For our older communities, successful revitalization will mean seeing to it that the workforce in our communities is up to that task. The standard of living of our nation, as well as our communities, is incredibly and inextricably tied to the productivity of our workforce. As we look to the future, we have to think about how can we continue to upgrade the skills and productivity of young people and the workforce more broadly in our communities. If we are to successfully reinvent and revitalize our communities, we must focus on preparing the workforce of the future. Let me conclude by reminding you that the theme of this year's conference is bridging growth and opportunity. For me, someone who's been in education for nearly 40 years in one form or another, I can think of no better bridge to opportunity than education. Education is a bridge for our young people and a bridge for our communities. As someone who spent those 3 decades, I think this is one of the most paramount investments and challenges that we face. It's critical for the long-run health and prosperity of our nation. Education expands opportunity, leads to more innovation, and enhances productivity. In the end, this leads to better economic outcomes and stronger communities. I'm excited that this year's conference will highlight the critical role of education and workforce development and the role that plays in reinventing our older communities. We are honored to host a sit-down with superintendents a panel session that will give you an opportunity to engage a dialogue with school superintendents from several older industrial cities. This is your chance to discuss how community development and educational leaders can work together to connect people with the right skills and the jobs of the future. This is another example where those of you who think about workforce development can get ahead of the puck and score a goal for our communities. The work you do, building these bridges to opportunity, is about creating a better future for all of us who live in these special places. It will not be easy. There is no quick fix, but it'll be one of the most important things we can do. And I want to thank you all for being here and participating in this year's conference. Thank you very much.
All right, let's get started. Thank you so much, Dr. Plosser. More than a year and a half ago, we started reaching out to a bunch of stakeholders, asking them what were the key issues in your communities. And while they didn't all use the same language, this whole theme around social mobility, economic inequality, it kept being brought up in different environments and by different stakeholders. And so we thought about how we could frame this conversation for our conference attendees. And I will tell you, when you start inviting people to conferences to speak, you always assume somebody's going to turn you down. My self-confidence is at an all-time high because our A-team agreed to participate in this session. And so we feel extraordinarily lucky to have three of the brightest thought leaders in this whole conversation here with us today. And so I want to give you just a brief highlight on how we're going to move forward, and then we'll have some time hopefully to open it up for question and answer. I know we're running a little behind, but we will, we promise it'll be well worth it. First, we're going to ask Raj Chetty to come up and share with us some of his work on the issue of social mobility. Raj Chetty is the Bloomberg Professor of Economics at Harvard University, and many of you have seen his research in the press and conversations about just the importance of this work in continuing the dialogue around our economy and where people are fitting and will fit in the future. After Raj presents, we will have Scott Spencer, Associate Director for Advocacy and Influence for the Annie E. Casey Foundation, moderate a conversation between Raj and Angela Glover Blackwell, CEO and founder of PolicyLink, and Manuel Pastor, Professor of Sociology and American Studies, American and Ethnic Studies from the University of Southern California. They will have a conversation around these issues, commenting both on Raj's presentation and his work, as well as the broader themes of how you implement this in the communities in which we all work. And so we're very excited to get started with this opening plenary session, and pleased to join me in welcoming Raj Chetty to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here speaking at this conference on the important topic of growth and opportunity. And I'm especially delighted to address an audience that combines practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, because I think that's really the critical group to get together to move this debate and this important topic forward. So I'd like to start off by framing the discussion by talking about the idea of the American dream, which is, I think, a core aspect of the issue of opportunity and a core aspect of the American social fabric. Now, there are many ways in which you might think about measuring the American dream and its health and existence. I'd like to focus for concreteness on one particular statistic: the odds that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution reaches the top fifth. So take a child who's starting out relatively low in the income distribution, in the bottom 20%. What are the chances that that child reaches the top fifth? So let's look at the data. And this shows you the statistics in the United States, where that probability is 7.5%, compared with Denmark, where we have comparable data, and the probability is 11.7%, and Canada, where it's 13.5%. So some people react to these statistics by saying, Even in Canada, the odds of success sort of achieving the American dream, they don't seem terribly high, right? Only 13%. Well, you have to remember the important fact that unfortunately you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%, right? So the maximum number that this can ever reach is 20%. And so the way I like to think about it instead is that these are actually pretty big differences. One way to look at it is that your chances of achieving the so-called American dream are actually about 2 times higher in Canada than in the US. And so motivated by that, a lot of people have recognized that there are significant differences in social mobility between the US and other countries, and many people are concerned about this. But what's striking to me and what's been the focus of the recent research in our group at Harvard has been that upward mobility, the type of measure that I'm talking about, or many related statistics that basically tell the same story, that form of upward mobility actually varies more within the United States than it does across countries. And that's what I'll show you in this talk. So what we do is we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the US. We divide the US into what are called commuting zones, collections of counties. We've split the US into 740 parts. And then we use anonymous earnings records on 40 million children and their parents. So think of this as an application of big data to public policy issues. And we classify children based on where they grew up and track them no matter where they live as adults. So we basically ask, what are your chances of achieving the American dream and moving up in the income distribution based on where you grew up? So this map here illustrates what we find. So what this map shows is it's a heat map, and the way it's constructed is that we compute the probability of reaching the top fifth of the income distribution starting from the bottom fifth, the statistic that I started out with, for every area of the US. And we split the areas into deciles, seen as you see by the 10 color codes there, and we color the areas based on their level of upward mobility. So in the top 10% of areas, the lightest colored areas, they have the highest levels of upward mobility in the US. And you can see that in those places, if you grew up in the bottom fifth, you actually have more than a 16.8% chance of reaching the top fifth. So that number is higher than what we saw for Canada and for Denmark, right? If you look at the other end of the spectrum, the darkest red areas, you have less than a 4.8% chance of going from the bottom fifth to the top fifth. So unfortunately, kids growing up in the very dark colored areas, if they grow up in a family in poverty, they have very little chance of escaping poverty. And rates of upward mobility in those areas are lower than any developed country for which we currently have data. Now, there's a lot of data on this map. Let me describe to you as what we see as some of the broad patterns. So the first and immediately obvious pattern is that there's very broad regional variation, right? So the Southeast in particular has exceptionally low rates of upward mobility. In contrast, the Great Plains and parts of the West Coast and East Coast have very high rates of upward mobility. Second, while your eye is originally drawn to the broad regional variation, there's actually considerable variation within states. 45% of the variance is actually within states in this map and within relatively narrow geographic areas. So let me draw your eye, for example, to the contrast between Ohio and Pennsylvania. We think of Ohio and Pennsylvania as being fairly similar in terms of demographics and economic structure, yet Pennsylvania is dramatically better than Ohio in terms of rates of social mobility. A third pattern that you see, which is a little bit hard to pick out in this map, but is a clear pattern in the data, is that urban areas tend to have much lower rates of social mobility than rural areas. So notice, for example, Iowa or rural Illinois versus Chicago or Milwaukee on the map. And an important thing to remember there is that these rural areas that have very high rates of upward mobility, the kids who are succeeding in places like Iowa, they are not living in Iowa when we're measuring their income as adults. They've moved on to Chicago or to New York or to somewhere else. So these rural communities are generating very high rates of upward mobility, even though the most talented people who've really succeeded have moved to other places afterward, which I think is a really striking phenomenon. And then the final pattern I'll mention, which is just illustrates the granularity and the power of these types of data, are look at South Dakota and North Dakota, two of the states with the highest levels of upward mobility, the lightest colors. You'll notice that there's one very sharp exception to that, which is the lower left corner of South Dakota, where you see some of the darkest red areas, the areas with the lowest levels of upward mobility in the US. And those turn out to be some of the biggest Native American reservations in the US, where consistent with historical evidence, we know that there's chronic intergenerational poverty. You see that being picked up in these statistics. So there's a lot more to be explored and learned from these data, but I think what I take away from this is that there's a great deal of variation in upward mobility even within the US, and it's not just the cross-country comparisons that we should be focusing on, it's really a community-level issue, and that's why I think this conference is so relevant for this particular question. So let me talk briefly about some of the statistics for the biggest metro areas, because they're hard to pick out on the map of the US. So among the 50 largest cities, the city with the highest level of upward mobility as measured by this statistic is San Jose, California, and then you see a number of other places like Seattle, Salt Lake City, Boston, all of which rank very highly in terms of rates of upward mobility. At the other end of the spectrum, take Charlotte, Milwaukee, Atlanta, or Indianapolis, your odds of moving from the bottom fifth to the top fifth are, only 4 or 5% in these places. Your odds of moving from the bottom to the top would be nearly 2 or 3 times as large if you grew up in some of the other cities in the US, like Salt Lake City or San Jose. So there's really substantial variation in social mobility within the United States. So a very natural question to ask is, what drives that difference in upward mobility across areas? What can we do to possibly make Charlotte look more like San Jose or Salt Lake City? So the first clues for us as researchers came from the fact that the spatial variation emerges at very early ages. In particular, in low mobility areas, low-income kids have much higher teenage birth rates and much lower college attendance rates. So by the time kids are 15, 16, 17, you're starting to see most of these spatial differences across areas emerge. And in particular, it's not only when they enter the labor market that you're seeing the differences. So that suggests that it's factors that are affecting kids while they're growing up, rather than the types of jobs that are available in an area that are the key determinants of this variation in social mobility. So what are those factors? I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of the factors we investigated. There's a lot more detail on the project website and in our papers. So the first thing we started out doing is exploring racial differences. So the most obvious pattern from the map, which many of you will have recognized, is that areas with larger African American populations, like the Southeast or some of the Rust Belt cities, have much lower rates of upward mobility than areas with smaller African American populations. And in fact, you see that pattern very clearly in the data. This is plotting upward mobility rates across communities versus the fraction of Black residents in the area, and you see a correlation of -0.6, quite a strong relationship between these two variables. Now, a critical caveat in interpreting that fact is the following. Even white Americans living in areas with large African American populations have lower rates of upward mobility. So this is not a story about race at the individual level. So what I mean is, it's not that African American kids, conditional on parent income, have lower chances of moving up in the income distribution. There's some of that type of difference, but the more important driver of the variation in the data is, if you redraw the map that I started out with, restricting to the white population, it would look very similar to what I just showed you. So in particular, low-income white kids growing up in Atlanta or Charlotte have very low odds of moving up in the income distribution. And so the question is, racial shares seem very strongly correlated with this variation, but it's not an individual level effect, it's something operating at the community level. And so one potential mechanism for that is the historical legacy of segregation in the United States. We know that areas with larger African American populations tend to be more segregated, and they tend to be more segregated not just by race, but also by income, meaning that lower income people are not living in proximity to higher income people. And that, sociologists have argued for a long time, could have adverse effects on kids' outcomes because you're less exposed to better peers, you have less access to good schools and other public goods and so forth. And so we think one of the important channels here might actually be segregation, and that is in fact what we find in the data as the first strongest correlate of differences in upward mobility across areas. Now, I'm going to quickly list a few of the other key correlated factors, and I'm happy to discuss further in the panel discussion. So another very strong correlate is the level of income inequality in an area. Cities with a smaller middle class tend to also have much lower levels of social mobility. Interestingly, however, we find no correlation between extreme upper tail inequality, top 1% income shares, and differences in social mobility across areas. So it seems like it's something about the middle class that's highly associated with social mobility. A third strong correlate, which I'll come back to in more detail, is differences in school quality across areas. Places with better schools tend to have higher levels of social mobility, as you might expect. A fourth very strong correlate is family structure. In fact, the single strongest variable that we find in terms of correlation with social mobility is the fraction of single parents in an area. Areas with more single parents have substantially lower rates of upward mobility. Again, however, just like the race fact, this is not the direct effect of kids growing up in single parent versus two parent households. We find that even if your own parents are married, if you live in an area with a lot of single parents, your chances of moving up in the income distribution are much lower. So again, it points to something about community level factors and not just individual level factors. And then the fifth and final factor we identify as a very strong correlate is social capital. So social capital is the idea of sort of social cohesiveness, the importance of, say, religion in an area, the connectedness of a society. The idea of social capital was really popularized by my colleague Bob Putnam, who wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone, which many of you might have heard about, which talks about the decline of social capital in the US. And the reason for the title of that book is one of the measures of social capital that Putnam uses is the number of bowling alleys in an area. Now, I was actually amazed to find in our data that the number of bowling alleys is very strongly correlated with rates of upward mobility. But I think that illustrates well something that I want to emphasize, that you want to think about these factors as correlations and not causal effects, right? Because I'm pretty sure the solution here is not to build more bowling alleys in order to increase upward mobility. So given that, I want to now move on to talk about what actual causal effects might be and what the relevant set of policies are to improve upward mobility. I think the 5 factors give us hints about where to look to improve mobility, but they don't identify causal mechanisms or policy tools. So what specific policies can help? So for illustration, and picking up on a theme of this conference and President Plosser's address, I'm going to focus on education policies and in particular on the impacts of teachers and show you some work we've done which really shows the causal impacts of education and the great value that investments in education have. I want to be very clear that I don't intend to say that the other factors are not important. I think this is likely to be a multifaceted problem where many solutions are required, but education is an area where we do have concrete evidence that we can make changes that will have very significant impacts. So in order to show you the impacts of education, in order to study this question, in our research group, we've again applied big data to study teachers' impacts. And what we're doing here in this study that I'm going to describe is linked information from school district records for one of the biggest urban school districts in the United States, where we get data on 2.5 million children who've written 18 million tests over a 20-year period. We link that data to United States federal income tax returns, which allows us to measure things like kids' earnings, college attendance, and teenage birth in adulthood. So we're basically able to ask, how does the quality of your teacher when you were in 3rd grade or in 4th grade affect how much you're earning when you're 30 years old, okay? Now, in order to answer that question, you first need to define a measure of the quality of teachers. In order to show you that some teachers have large positive impacts relative to others, we need to have some notion of quality. One prominent measure of teacher quality, which is very topical and very controversial issue in the current policy debate, is what are called teacher value-added measures. So many of you will have heard of these. The idea of a value-added measure is really very simple. It's to ask, how much does a teacher raise her students' test scores relative to their test scores when they came in? So if, for example, I'm a 3rd grade teacher, I would take my students' test scores at the end of 3rd grade and subtract their test scores at the beginning of 3rd grade and call that the teacher's value added. That's essentially what it boils down to. So what I want to do is show you that kids who have high value added teachers do much better in the long run, and that this can be an important force for changing social mobility. Now, if you step back and think about how you would ideally answer that question, what you would want to do, if you think about it from like a science experiment point of view, you take a whole bunch of teachers, calculate their value added based on prior students whom they've taught, and then you take a new batch of kids and you tell the parents, look, we want to study this really important social policy question of whether and how teachers matter. So we've identified some teachers as being highly effective and other teachers as being much less effective. We're going to run an experiment with your kids where we're going to randomly assign some of them to ineffective teachers and others to effective teachers. Now, as you can imagine, most parents don't want to participate in that experiment, right? So what we do instead, taking advantage of these large data sets, is essentially find that experiment in the data that we have. And so let me show you how that works, and this will be the last set of results that I talk about. So we exploit the fact that there's a lot of turnover in schools over time. Lots of teachers come in and leave and so forth, and that essentially creates random variation from the perspective of the students in the quality of the teachers they have. So I'd like you to think about the following quasi-experiment. Suppose we track a given school over time, and we look at students in 4th grade. And what happens in this school is that as we're going through time, in 1996, a very high value-added teacher, a teacher in the top 5% of the distribution, enters the school and starts to teach subsequent 4th graders in that school. So what I want to do is now, we take real data from thousands of events like this in our data set, and I'm going to track test scores over time around the entry of that teacher. You can see before that teacher comes in, test scores are kind of bouncing along around the average without much of a trend. As soon as that high value-added teacher enters, test scores immediately jump up, and they continue to stay at a high level for subsequent cohorts of kids who are taught by that high value-added teacher. Now, you all know from your science classes in high school that in any good experiment, you have to have both a treatment group, which is what this is here. This is where the high value-added teacher enters, but you also want to have a control group to make sure that nothing else changed at the same time, right? So a very natural control group in this context is to look at test scores in 3rd grade, because nothing happened in this school in 3rd grade. The better teacher came in 4th grade and should have had no impact on 3rd grade test performance. And so let's look at 3rd grade test scores. They're in fact perfectly flat around the entry of that 4th grade teacher. That type of evidence shows us clearly that these high value-added teachers are actually significantly improving student achievement on standardized tests. But what's more important for the topic we're discussing here is if you then track these kids going forward and look at longer-term impacts. The children who happen to be assigned to high value-added teachers when they were in 3rd grade, on the right side of this graph, they're significantly more likely to attend college when they're adults. They have significantly higher earnings, and they're significantly less likely to have a teenage birth. So along a wide spectrum of outcomes, you see that if you happen to have a high value-added teacher when you were in 4th grade, you have significantly better outcomes on a variety of margins. So let me wrap up by talking about magnitudes and policy implications. So one way to think about the magnitude of the importance of education is the following exercise. Suppose we take the bell curve of teacher quality, and we do the following illustrative and feasible policy calculation. Let's say we take the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of this distribution of teacher quality, and we replace them with teachers of average quality, which is in principle something we should be able to do in our schools. We might do that through better teacher training or recruiting new teachers. There are a variety of ways in which you might try to improve average teacher quality. What would the impacts of that be? Our estimates, what I just showed you, is that that change in teacher quality would increase students' earnings by $50,000 per child over their lifetime, which translates to a gain of $1.4 million per classroom of 28 students. And if you discount that back to present value at a 5% interest rate, you get a present value of $250,000. Because you can see that the magnitudes here are quite large. Teachers have really large impacts. Now that result has been translated to some extent to the policy debate where you see here the president saying that we know a good teacher can increase the lifetime income of a classroom by over $250,000 in the 2012 State of the Union. And then at the more local level, Mayor Bloomberg and many others have talked about potential ways of improving and retaining the best teachers in our classrooms. Let me now conclude, building on that, with some lessons to think more about in this conference for reinventing older communities. So one simple lesson from the type of evidence I've been showing you is that improving the quality of primary education can be quite valuable. And I want to stress here that this is not just about spending more money. The US already spends more than other developed countries which have better outcomes in schools. Instead, I think it's about focusing on the key inputs, such as attracting and retaining talented teachers, and really honing in on how we make our schools better for the money we're already spending. A second implication of the broader set of evidence I've presented here is that I think it makes a lot of sense to take a place-based approach to improving opportunity. Typically, the discussion of mobility has focused on national policy changes, but as I hope I've illustrated, I think social mobility is really a local, community-level issue in the US. And so let's focus on trying to improve places like Charlotte, Indianapolis, and Atlanta. A third lesson is that I think we can harness big data to develop a scientific evidence base for evaluating a variety of policies. We've constructed mobility statistics for every county in the US, which you can download from the project website. Moreover, going forward, we're working with the US government to create automated annual reporting of mobility statistics of the type we've constructed by county so that stakeholders like yourselves can actually measure the impacts of new interventions that you're attempting directly so that we can really see what works and what doesn't. And finally, what I've been heartened by is that just collecting and disseminating local performance data seems like it can spark social change. I think simply recognizing that there are differences in mobility and that they're changing over time in some ways can really motivate people to pay attention to these important issues. So to conclude, let me come back to some of the statistics that I showed you on upward mobility across areas. You can look at this either from a pessimistic or an optimistic point of view. One perspective is, isn't it too bad that upward mobility rates in the US are much lower than in other countries, as I showed you on the initial slide? I actually take a much more positive view than that. I see this variation across areas as creating an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that if we can figure out how to make places like Memphis or Indianapolis look like San Jose or Dubuque, Iowa, we can dramatically change what social mobility, opportunity, and growth look like in the United States. The challenge for us as researchers is to figure out what exactly it is that's different across these places that we can change to improve mobility. And the challenge for the practitioners and for all of you here is to do the more important work of trying to implement those policy changes. I'm optimistic that if we work together, we can create opportunities for success for every child from Atlanta to San Jose going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And, we're inviting our fellow panelists up. Angela goes from Blackwell, Manuel Pastor, and we're going to engage in the dialogue for about the next 30 minutes. And what we're going to do, we're going to give Angela and Manuel the opportunity to actually respond to Raj's presentation, which is excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting and thought-provoking. I have a couple of questions for them, but I'm going to turn to you probably about 10 minutes, at about 25 minutes of, and see if there are questions from the audience. There are a couple of, there's at least one mic up here. There are two mics up here, so when you get up, please identify yourselves, where you're from, because one of the benefits of this conference is that we have people from all aspects of the field that are working in community development, so it would be good for you to introduce yourself so people can get to know you. But I'm going to turn right first to Angela. One of the great things about being the moderator for this session is that I don't have to do much of anything. These folks are pretty much on autopilot. A dozen years ago, Angela and Manuel actually helped co-author a book together on searching for the uncommon common ground. And I think that may actually serve as a great stepping off point for a part of your response to this, but I'm going to turn to Angela first and let her give some comments.
Thank you, Scott. Wonderful presentation, and I'm so happy about your work. The last point that you were making about how getting this kind of data out there can really spark conversation. We are witnessing it, and we've been witnessing it for the past few months, year really. I am not a researcher. I'm fascinated by big data, and the thing that's fascinating me most about big data is how it tells you the same thing that small data tells you. Because everything that was in your presentation, a lot of us have been talking about for a very long time. And this issue of race is one that I'm glad that you talked about segregation right in your opening comment, because there's such a tendency in this nation to want to run away from it and to be able to say it's not about race. And it is so helpful to be able to bring people back to seeing how the impact of racial segregation and discrimination has not just hurt those that have been discriminated against, but it hurts us all. And when we look at areas of the country where we've had the most profound discrimination, we see that the stinginess in terms of education and job opportunities and looking for ways to be able to improve everybody's opportunity, the stinginess around that causes everybody to really suffer. What I'm really struck by from looking at your presentation is there really is a clear way out. You chose one, but you could have chosen any of more than a dozen. And in each one of those, there's a clear pathway that will allow us to be able to really create those ladders of opportunity and get everybody on it. So when I look at your presentation, what it says to me is that America's at a crossroads, that we really have become a nation in which our fate is all bound together. We can't get over that. And we have learned so much about how to create opportunity. Now what we need to do is spread it. We need to have an equity approach. We need to make sure that the best that we know is available to all of us. And when we get that right, we get everything right. Because we've become a nation in which the majority are people of color. The very ones who've been left behind are going to make up the future of the nation. The nation's fate is tied to them, and we know what to do. Thank you, Raj.
This is extraordinarily important work, and I'm so glad you're doing it. I've had a chance to know a few of your colleagues, and I knew that I'd like you, but I didn't know how much. But one of the reasons why I think it's important is because in the United States there's been a series of studies to which I've contributed looking at the relationship between inequality and economic growth in America's metropolitan areas, and I'll say a word about that in a second. But the conversation about inequality is usually cast as something different than mobility. Well, maybe the United States is a very unequal place, but at least we're able to make progress over time. But internationally, we see this high correlation between inequality and lack of mobility, and I think we see it in the data as well that you're showing. In our own work, we've tried to take a look at both what predicts economic growth and then more recently looking at the sustainability of growth, kind of going off of a study that the International Monetary Fund did about 2 years ago, in which they looked at growth spells, how long growth lasts in the developing world, and they found a little bit to their surprise that the most significant predictor of a shortened growth spell, of falling off a growth path, was income inequality at the beginning. And so we've actually just looked at that, replicated that in a paper that'll be coming out in Urban Studies, looking at employment growth for America's metropolitan areas. And what we found, interestingly, is that there are things you would think would predict the length of a growth spell, like economic structure, but like the International Monetary Fund, the single most important fact that would predict you falling out of a growth spell was actually the initial level of income inequality. The other really important factors were residential segregation, gaps between cities and suburbs in terms of poverty rate, essentially social separation. So I think you're onto something there, Raj.
So, as I started out saying, we've got a broad swath of people here that are in the room, a group of different stakeholders, different perspectives, different approaches to this work, and you've each actually talked about the role of different stakeholders. But I'd like to just sort of go a little deeper into sort of who are some of the stakeholders that need to be involved in really trying to move the needle on this work, and how do we engage them? One of the conversations that we actually had with a group of folks from the Federal Reserve and philanthropy yesterday was that there's a conversation that needs to be had with the business sector, as an example. And you know, we're sort of grappling with how do we engage those types of stakeholders and what are the conversations that we have with them to try to move this conversation forward.
Well, I do think that stakeholders are going to be key. Everybody has to be engaged, but let me take some segments. One of the things that we have to really do to deal with social mobility and economic mobility is we need to grow good jobs, which means that we need to make sure that the jobs that already exist are jobs that can support families, and we need to think about how to create new jobs. The business community is going to be absolutely key, and so is government, because government does a lot of spending and influences a lot of spending, and every time that it's engaged in spending, it ought to be thinking about how to really promote more inclusiveness, how to promote equity, how to get more people working. And business has to be in total partnership, both doing that when those opportunities arise and when they don't. But the other thing we need to do is we need to really build the capabilities of the American people, the kind of investing that allows people to participate, which means all of our education community, those stakeholders need to be engaged, but higher education, community colleges, four-year colleges, people who are engaged in that way. And we need to remove barriers and expand opportunity, which means that both people who are at risk of being left behind have to be engaged aggressively, understanding how to take advantage of opportunity when it exists, and people who are advocates and decision makers have to think about how to remove barriers. Just give me one quick example. So many people, particularly in the Black community, have been incarcerated and are returning home. And when they return home, they need to be part of the economy, being able to create strategies that allow for that participation, like not having to indicate that you have a criminal record if it doesn't apply to that job, can be very important. So removing barriers at the same time that we're using place-based strategies to expand them. So I haven't left anybody out, and if I have, I didn't mean to. There's nobody who doesn't have a stake in making sure that we create the kind of mobility that has been one of the things that we have prided ourselves on as a nation, whether it's been true or not.
So I spend about a third of my time speaking to business audiences, and most recently to the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, and then keynoting Joint Venture Silicon Valley Network's annual conference. And what I find is that businesses are now particularly concerned about this issue of inequality and the lack of mobility. Recall that during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the #1 topic this last year was inequality and the risks that it poses to the global economy. So I think there's a business case here to be made, and people are beginning to make it, both around the sustainability of growth, around the lack of mobility, et cetera. Part of the reason the strategy, I think, for making sure that business comes on board is actually talking about the changing demographics of the country. The fact that by the year 2042, 2043, the U.S. will be majority people of color. About 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. About 10 years before that, the majority of those under the age of 18, people of color. That's the next America. And if we churn through this level of class inequality and race inequality into the next America, we're talking about a very unhealthy economy. And this is particularly so because what used to look like an age pyramid in 1945, with a lot of young people at the bottom and not so many folks at the top of the age pyramid in terms of age, is becoming in the United States now an age cylinder. What that means is that essentially everybody who's working has to be far more productive than they ever were to support those who are retired and those who might be coming up. And there's a business case there to be made.
I also think that many stakeholders need to be involved, including businesses. One thing that I think is very heartening in this regard is that many stakeholders are interested in this issue because they directly will benefit from greater social mobility. So unlike the debate about inequality, which I think some people are genuinely and correctly concerned about, but others have the view that maybe if somebody made a lot of money because they started a great business, we should let them keep it. So you could have different views about inequality. I've come across very few people who think that social mobility is not a desirable goal. And the reason is if you bring people at the bottom of the income distribution up in the income distribution and help them succeed, that not only helps them, it helps the economy as a whole. You have more innovation, you have more creation of jobs. And so I think one of the great things about this particular angle is that you can bring all the stakeholders together because it's in everyone's interest to have more social mobility.
So Raj, in your presentation, you sort of you pointed to the fact that, particularly around education, that there are other countries in the world that are doing it well and spending less dollars than we are in aggregate against the United States. But is there any place in the United States that's actually doing it right? And I would say that to any one of you. I mean, this work around inclusiveness, around social mobility, around economic opportunity, are you seeing examples of people who are getting either parts of it or the whole right?
Well, I'm going to look forward to hearing Manuel answer that question because he's written about it, but before he tells you definitively, there are a couple of things I want to lift up. I noticed that Dayton was, I think, number 47, so really not much social mobility at all going on there, and I've been so impressed with Welcome Dayton, that Dayton actually looked around and realized they were losing population, but not engaged in growth at all, but when they looked at who was coming, they realized they were attracting some immigrants, and that they were actually contributing a lot. So they decided, let's get aggressive about attracting immigrants. Let's stop asking about immigration status for people who are victims of crime or witnesses. Let's help people who are doctors and engineers move more quickly through the bureaucracy to begin to contribute. Let's do some things to help people start small businesses and buy homes. And the result is that in Dayton, they've seen 400 people buy new, I'm sorry, on that data point, I don't exactly have it. It has a 400 in it, but I don't know what it relates to. So I'm going to skip over it. But in Dayton, they have seen more businesses open. They're seeing people really become engaged. They are seeing more home ownership. I think that's a wonderful example of where things are going. I've got lots of examples like that. There are islands of excellence all across this nation where people are coming to the conclusion they need to do things differently, and they're very exciting. I have more stories to tell, but I'm interested in hearing Manuel.
Yeah, Angela's right that I wrote a book with Chris Benner about 2 years ago. It has the title Just Growth. The idea being that some people think that growth alone will solve all problems. We argue that you need not just growth, you need just growth. You need growth that's intentional about equity. And in the book, what we tried to do was to try to use a data-driven approach to identify metropolitan regions that are doing better on achieving economic growth and achieving social equity. We're actually writing our second book about that topic. I think it'll be called Juster Growth because we're expanding a little bit. And one of the things that we found that I think was kind of interesting, much to our surprise, we used a logistic regression strategy to look at what were the things that would predict you falling in the camp of having more equity and more growth. Interestingly, having a large minority, middle class, was very significant because that was a group that had an interest in both growth and dealing with poverty. But what we found when we went out and did case studies, and we're finding it now too, is that there was something else that was very important too, and it's what we called, clumsily, an epistemic community. Well, now what the hell does that mean? Only an academic could come up with that term, right? Epistemology, what you know, community, who you know it with. So what we found out was that in the locations that were doing better, there were a lot of mechanisms for stakeholders to come together and form a common understanding of the sort of future of their region. But we're talking about it now as kind of having roots, relationship, and reason. People who are deeply rooted in an area, who are building relationships together, who are able to come to kind of reasonable conclusions about what the strategy might be. Let me give you one example. Some of you may know, and this is one that actually shows up in the data more recently, is doing pretty well over the last 30 years relative to its census region with regard to both economic growth and slowing the increase in poverty, and that's San Antonio, Texas. And just 2 years ago in San Antonio, the city, which is a large part of the metropolitan area, passed a tax to support pre-K for disadvantaged kids, sales tax. Remarkably, it passed. Perhaps unremarkably, the mayor supported it and social movement supported it, but so did the Chamber of Commerce, who saw this pre-tax to support disadvantaged kids as being essential to having a workforce development strategy for 20 years from now into the future. And I think that there's a kind of question about what are the policies we need to put in place in terms of workforce development with sector strategies and affordable housing and transit, et cetera. But more important than that is putting together the consensus that we actually need to do these things in the first place. And I think that's about bringing the stakeholders together.
Can I mention one other? This is not an older industrial city, but Seattle actually is doing remarkable work in terms of creating more equity and inclusion. They have lifted it to be important. It has become important throughout King County. They are measuring how they're impacting those who are too often left behind, disaggregated by race. They're asking questions about transportation. So when they're putting together their transportation plan, they're actually looking to see who uses transportation, who relies on it, what do they use it for, where are they working, what times are they going to work, and making sure they're aligning their schedule with those equity needs. They're also looking at who needs to get employed and what are they doing to make sure that they're reaching out so that everything that they're doing, they're measuring against equity and inclusion, and it's creating more and more opportunity. There's no reason why other places can't take that same model and use it. If you want it, you've got to make it important, and then you've got to measure it, and you have to make decisions that are informed by the data. This continuous improvement using data is one of the essential ways to deal with creating more economic mobility.
You know, and another element of the Seattle story is something that they call the Seattle process. In the Seattle process, some people say it's just talking everything to death till people give up, right? But the Seattle process is what allowed them to create day labor sites in places the community accepts. The Seattle process is what allowed them to work at affordable housing. And it's the Seattle process that brought together business, labor, and community, 25 members into an advisory committee on inequality for the mayor, who just agreed to the $15 minimum wage. 23 of the 25 folks agreed on it. One person who disagreed was a Trotskyist. That was no surprise. And the other one was a libertarian. But 23 of 25, they talked it through. They came up with a phase. This conversation is as important as the policies.
So let me just make 2 points that I think build on what both Angela and Manuel have said. So coming back to the example of Dayton, it's very interesting to hear. So one thing to remember in our statistics is that there are 4 kids born in 1980 whose incomes we're measuring today. So naturally, you can't measure social mobility for kids who are just growing up in Dayton, right? Because they haven't grown up yet, so you can't measure their earnings. So social mobility statistics are always going to be a little bit dated from that perspective. So it'll be very interesting to see going forward that Dayton, given what it's doing now, do we see, and I expect we will based on what you're saying, changes in social mobility. And that's why it's so important to continue to monitor these statistics going forward. And I think an important message here is that these things are likely to be malleable when you have efforts like what we're hearing about in Dayton. The other point I want to make is, coming back to the original question of what places are doing it right within the US, couple of examples related to the theme of education. One is the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, which you hear a lot about. I think that's a good example of a place where outcomes do seem to have demonstrably changed under difficult circumstances. I think there's a lot to be learned there. Another example, which I briefly alluded to here in our data, you see that Iowa and places like that historically do extremely well, even today, but also in the past. And they've got this very unusual feature of helping families move up in the income distribution. But then, as I said, something like 70% of the kids who are moving from the bottom to the top are leaving Iowa as adults, and a new group of people are coming in. Yet again, through the schools and the community, you get another generation coming up. So studying what exactly is going on in those places, I think, would be very valuable as well.
You know, Raj said something which I think is very important to keep in mind here, and it's actually about San Jose. San Jose in 1980 had a pretty thick middle class. It had a manufacturing sector, and it was, people, when they look back to those days, really think of it as a very middle class location. It's now become very polarized with some of the highest levels of inequality in the United States. So one of the things to realize is that sometimes if a place is successful and growth gets going, it starts to disequalize. And one of the things, if you want to really deal with that, is also to deal with the problems of success, the issues of gentrification, of people being left behind, et cetera. That's what Seattle is doing right now with its success.
You know, there's, and I keep on looking back to the audience because, like I said, there are a lot of practitioners here. One of the things the Federal Reserve does is they help to set sort of federal economic policy. And there was this part of your conversation was around place-based approaches. And for the folks out here who would look to the Federal Reserve and the sources of data that they provide and the research that they do sort of on a national scale, or in some of the banks even at a more local scale, is there any advice that you would want to give to them out in the audience about how to sort of take advantage of the information that the Federal Reserve provides as a way of sort of charting their own course for the work in their communities?
Well, I certainly would like to see anything that could provide more incentive to have informed place-based strategies to create more opportunity and inclusion in America. There is no question that we have become a nation in which where you live is the proxy for opportunity. It determines whether or not you get to go to a good school. It determines whether or not, if you're lucky enough to own a home, you can pull any value out of it when you need it. It determines whether you live near jobs or transportation that connect you to jobs. It even determines how long you live and how well you live while you live. And so many fellow Americans are living in places that have every one of the deficits I just alluded to. Even in communities that Raj cites is doing very well, like the San Francisco Bay Area, I can show you the pockets that are not doing well. And those places are defined by failing schools, inadequate infrastructure, not enough attention to help building healthy communities. And so being able to provide data and incentives and economic analysis of how investments in place help to improve entire regions. Regions cannot survive if they have all these places that are being left behind. Being able to really inspire the nation, businesses and governments and civic leaders and others to understand the return on really investing in place, I think would be wonderful.
I know they can take advantage of the depth of knowledge in your books too, Manuel. But before we go to you, just to cue you up, just in case you want to get questions up, to stand up and get to the mics. But I'll turn to you, Manuel.
Well, I think Angela said a lot. The other thing I would add that the Fed can really do is convening power. That is, bring people together. One of the things that it's done in both Los Angeles and Fresno and California is really bring together people to consider the future of the region and then to kind of look at other kinds of issues. So in Los Angeles, the Fed has hosted conversations on immigrant integration, dealing with finances in places that are pockets of poverty. I think actually just legitimizing this issue of inequality and the lack of mobility and making sure that it's a safe place for people to talk about it is an extraordinarily important thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both points. I think one important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these statistics is there's likely to be a lot of variation within the broad metro areas that we're showing, right? So we took a relatively coarse look at the data and what I've shown you here, but you can imagine drilling down much further to the county level, school district level within that, and you are going to find pockets that are doing better within each of these places and some that are doing worse. I think a place like the Federal Reserve, it's very hard to study the nation as a whole. You need to start to take more of a regional focus to really understand what's going on at that granular level. And I think the Fed banks can provide one point of focus to do that type of analysis.
All right, Brad?
Yes, I'm Brad Whitehead.
I think so.
Just keep talking.
Yeah, I'm Brad Whitehead. I'm with the Fund for Our Economic Future in Northeast Ohio. I'm one of those place-based people working at the coalface. And first of all, this is a terrific conversation. But I'd like to hear our panelists explore a little bit more about the growth dimensions of growth and opportunity, because it feels like we're often coming at this from the opportunity perspective, and at least from the ground, it feels like it's a much harder conversation to get the growth community involved in things. So for instance, Raj, your correlates here all seem to be opportunity-based correlates. And I'm just curious if you have any perspectives on economic structural correlates with mobility. It doesn't look like it's right to work versus non-right to work states. It doesn't appear to be a whole lot of other things. And so rather than treating the business community as a ubiquitous thing, can you unpack that a bit about what we know about economic structure and mobility?
Sure, yeah. So I haven't showed you a number of other correlates that we looked at that did not seem to be very strongly related to the differences in opportunity and mobility. We did look at a number of indicators of labor market structure or the types of businesses in an area. And for whatever reason, it turned out that those did not seem to be strong predictors of success. And you kind of see that on the map where you have places like the Silicon Valley area looking very good, but then you also have places like Montana and Iowa and parts of Texas and so forth. And so, again, I come away thinking businesses have an important role to play in terms of the types of jobs that are ultimately offered, the opportunities that people are able to get to, and also in giving back to the community and helping build foundations like better schools. But it doesn't directly seem to be a story about we need to have these types of industries and not those types of industries. Another piece of evidence that makes me think that is a lot of these differences in outcomes emerge at very early ages, well before kids start to work. And so it's really something about what's happening when kids are 10 years old, 15 years old, and not just about business structure. But I totally agree with you that growth is just as important as opportunity. And the theme that I think is coming from the panelists is that you want to think about both together and not as two separate things.
You know, in the work that we've done on the growth sustainability over time thing, what's interesting is the results are very similar. The dominant factors really are income inequality, residential segregation, social separation measures, which was a little bit to our surprise as well, that the traditional structural economic variables would not have as big an impact. There are three, though, that are worth highlighting. One is the share of immigrants. Turns out that having immigrants in your location actually does help economic growth, and that's not, it's the understanding that economic growth will attract immigrants, so this is trying to control by looking at the share of immigrants before. The second thing, which has a negative impact, and you're all experiencing it, is your share of manufacturing. If you have a very big manufacturing sector, that's a dampening impact on economic growth. The third thing that I think is a real takeaway is we found that what really helped predict economic growth on the education side was sort of economic growth in the middle. That is, people who had from a high school degree to an associate's degree, that helped us seem to drive balanced economic growth that was sustainable. I think one of the things that we often don't pay enough attention to is the community college system and how it intersects with workforce development. I think that's a thing that business is very interested in, particularly to solve some of the skill problems that the president was pointing to before. And I think that's a place to do really good work. And I think you're doing a little bit of that in Northeast Ohio.
I want to be quick so we have more questions. But PolicyLink this past year did a book with the Center for American Progress. It's called All in Nation, an economy that works for all. Really making the point that when you get the opportunity agenda right, when you get the equity agenda right, you really do positively impact growth and development. One of the things that we cited there as a result of a study was if we had had income equity between blacks and Latinos and whites in 2011, the GDP would have been $1.2 trillion higher. So when we're having a conversation about opportunity, we shouldn't think that's not a conversation about growth in the economy, because they really are bound together. And it's the demographic shift, and we become a nation in which the majority are people of color, it becomes even more so.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Harold Simon. I'm with Shelter Force Magazine. And I'd like to ask a question that follows up on what Scott asked. And I sort of want to direct it at you, Angela, but I'd love to hear everybody. Over the past few years, I have seen more than once words come from the administration that I read or heard from your organization first. So I'm in awe of how well you all have done that. And more than words, I've seen policies around food deserts and other things. You turned words into action. So my question is, there's a lot of good information, a huge amount of good information, and everything that people suggested about what to do with that data is important and right. But for the practitioners and advocates in the room, how do we get to bringing 25 people into a room for the Seattle conversation? How do we get to bringing the people together to convene, or getting the attention of people who can change policies? How do you use that? What's the very next step?
Wow. My first reaction is that both of my parents died 4 years ago. I wish they were here to hear you say that, what you said. They would have been thrilled. That was lovely. And the reason that your question is so important is because PolicyLink is a relatively new organization. We've been around for 15 years, but that's not really a long time. And the work that we have done with partners, Nate Smith from Atlanta is here in the audience. I don't know if the people with the reinvestment fund are here, but there's so many groups that we have worked with across the country. And collectively, we have been disciplined about seeing what we are learning at the local level, documenting when we're making progress, being able to present it in ways that are easily understood, and always coming as a group to be advocates for change. Not thinking that any one person with a smart idea can make change, but the people who are being impacted have to be part of telling their story. People who have been doing this work at the local community have to come and talk about what they've been through, and to try to measure the progress of the things you're lucky enough to get in place, like Promise Neighborhoods, which is built on the Harlem Children's Zone, the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which is built on something right here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Fresh Food Financing Initiative, some of the things that we're seeing in transportation. You've got to measure those results, because you may be lucky and have one administration that likes it, but the next administration won't be interested if you can't show it made a difference. So finding what works, discipline about bringing cohorts of people to talk about it, tracking the progress that's being made, and being able to reach out to those people who have the skill of translating a good idea into a policy framework. I think there's a lot more we need to do. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is actually 1:45, and I need to close out this session, but I want to, Angela had mentioned, I'm sorry, we can't take any more questions. But Angela had mentioned Dayton in her comment about places that work. And my own comment back to you folks is that I actually heard about Dayton 2 years ago at the Federal Reserve Conference here in Philadelphia and the work that they were doing. So that's sort of a plug for going to the sessions. And sort of a plug and a follow-up for what Harold said is one of the next steps that you can do is actually go into these sessions, learn from what other people are doing, make the connection between what the good ideas that you're hearing about and how you can take that next step with those conversations, and have a wonderful afternoon. Sessions begin at 2.
At 2 o'clock. Please help me thank our panel. I think it was a fantastic conversation. When these doors open, we have a team of people that are going to help you get to our sessions. Our sessions are located on the 4th floor and the 33rd floor. They are going to touch on the range of topics from demographics to transportation to tomorrow, a big conversation on education. So I hope you will, in fact, go to the sessions and enjoy your afternoon. We'll see you back here for a session on entrepreneurs reinventing the city at 3:45. Thank you.